Today I want to talk about the concept of evil, and particularly as it applies to some of the consequences of lockdown which we see all around us, and how Christians can respond to that by both praying that it will end, that evil will end, and acting in a way which replaces evil with good because of the way we behave in these difficult circumstances. I've filmed all around my house in the context of these blogs, and boy, it's difficult to find a fresh room. Here I am in our closet, our walk-in closet, in confinement, a fairly small, narrow space, illustrative of being locked down and contained today. Well, evil. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. That's how the very famous Lord's Prayer begins. And of course it contains the phrase about, and deliver us from evil, or as some of the modern translations have, deliver us from the evil one, evil personified in the devil and his activity. And we know that there is evil around everywhere, and it's a sad and difficult thing because it causes problems and pain for people. And then in the book of Romans, in the verse I want to read to you today, Paul gives us a kind of antidote to that. Just a very simple one-verse reading from Romans chapter 12, verse 21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And that last phrase, overcome evil with good. Now, it seems to me that we can all agree that the lockdown has had evil consequences. I'm not saying that governments who've imposed it are evil or that their intentions were evil, but surely politicians of both the left and the right politically can agree that something which so severely limits human freedom, which so severely contains human flourishing and activity, which so dreadfully affects health, mental and physical, should surely be resisted. Now, we know that lockdown may have been a necessary evil. There are scientists and medics, though reading the media you may not believe this, but there are scientists and medics, epidemiologists, who are not convinced that lockdown was the way to go. But assuming for a moment that it was the right thing to do for Western governments, it might have been a necessary evil, still it has massively evil consequences. And I've been quite surprised that there have been very few voices on any wing of politics, and even in the church, sadly, who've been shouting aloud about the massive impacts of this, and therefore the need not simply to resist the virus, which has tragically taken lives, but to resist the lockdown and get out of it as soon as we can because of the desperate evil it's caused for the pain in people's lives. And we could list them, and I've mentioned them before in these vlogs, not to depress us today, this great list, but to be realistic about the problems. Unemployment is going to soar. And we know that for every 1% rise in unemployment, there's a 2% rise in chronic conditions. Imagine for a moment if you have some kind of disability. Getting through to various government departments is a nightmare at the moment. Disabled people, people who are trying to get probate for a recently deceased loved one, are going through agonies of hours and hours of waiting and then never getting through on the phone. People trying to get carers allowance, people trying to get attendance allowance. Some of the very poorest, most vulnerable people in society are going through terribly difficult times right now because of lockdown. They say it's going to take at least 2 years for the National Health Service to get back anything like where it was. In the meantime, how many people will have given up the will to fight their condition? How many will have died or resigned themselves to a life of increasing painfulness and frustration? The criminal justice system, they're saying, is going to take 10 years to get back to its normal self, with cases in courts dragging out for that time. And that's real people suffering, victims who are not getting justice. Innocent people who've got a cloud of suspicion hanging over them, unresolved for all these years. Even guilty criminals, not knowing quite what their fate is, the length of their sentence, and so on. So we know that in the midst of all of this at the moment, pain results. That's not in any way referencing the developing world, where millions are going to be disadvantaged, millions are going to die, actually. Even now, though you rarely read this in the papers or hear it on the news, people are dying of starvation in Latin America, in Africa, and in parts of Asia. The news is silent about these things, but lockdown communities are communities in fear, communities where there's an explosive growth in domestic violence, living in fear at home, and so on. Well, I hope I've convinced you that lockdown is evil, maybe a necessary evil, but its consequences are horrific for many, many people. So we must be praying today with real serious intent about this whole situation, praying that human flourishing will be re-established, that governments will be given wisdom to break out of this vice-like grip, this sort of circle of despair which we seem to be in, learning to live with this virus, to make sure that we end the suffering as quickly and as efficiently as we can. And then, as our verse in Romans says, to be those who drive back evil, to look for the consequences of this pain everywhere and do what we can to alleviate it. What an amazing opportunity for the Church of Jesus going forward into these next few years. There'll be pain and suffering on a grand scale, nationally and internationally. How can we be doing good to overcome the consequences of evil? How can we be those whose money, whose time, whose loving prayers and effort works towards encouraging good to flourish and overcoming the horrible effects of this period we've just been through? So today, recognise the seriousness of the situation we find ourselves in. Commit to pray, commit to love and to give. Commit not to be engulfed with these evil actions, and find our hope in prayer and in seeing the victory of Jesus and being agents of goodness when we see suffering and pain all around us.